All right, today I want to talk about how to change your values without losing yourself completely. At some point, the values that helped you to survive will stop helping you to live. The principle that once gave you clarity will start to produce contradiction in your life. And what once felt like a conviction that was clear and guiding and like a North Star for you will feel like an entrapment and like a cage, like it's too rigid and too small or too punishing to sustain you, or something that you thought motivated you, like love, will turn on you and betray you and make you feel like this isn't worth living for, or like I need to reframe this value because it has too high of a place in my life to the point where its configuration is not serving me anymore. Lots of ways our values change. And when they do change, they create a lot of unsettlement in the self. And so you try to loosen that value from within your system, and then something breaks. Not because you were wrong to change your value system, but because the value you tried to adjust wasn't just a rule that you abided by. It was part of the scaffolding that actually held you together. For a lot of people, this is religion or their faith in God. For a lot of people, this is their views, quite honestly, of love and relationships and things that they ought to be able to expect from other people. And for other people, it's trust, right? I thought I could trust people. I thought people were good, right? These are assumptions and values, and this whole interconnected system of beliefs and values and standards that I hold myself to. If you shift those at too profoundly deep of a level, they will create a crisis of identity. The rules that you try to change when you try to modify a personal value, you have to recognize you're trying to modify something that defined your permissions, something that completely um, defined how you thought about your own personal constraints, your sense of who you are under pressure. And when that shifts, the self loses its shape. And this is not a moral failure. It's a structural instability. You're creating a rupture. And today I want to talk about how to adapt your value system, how to be more supple in your value system without collapsing the coherence of that system that made it usable in the first place. So, first of all, let's look at the structural risk of revising values. The moment you start to question a core value, a secondary fear emerges. If this changes, what else goes with it in my life? So you held, for example, to the value of loyalty, and you kept it from becoming something transactional. You held to the value of rigor, and it protected you from becoming lazy. You held to independence, and it insulated you from manipulation. But now those same values are producing rather guilt. They're producing fatigue. They're producing emotional distance in your life. You're saying, I might need to rethink these values. So you don't want to abandon them, but you can no longer bear their cost. So this is where we look at philosopher William James and his work, The Sentiment of Rationality. James basically argues that moral comfort doesn't come from perfection. It comes from a felt sense of coherence. So we need to believe that our actions make sense together, even when they aren't optimal actions. And when a value starts producing internal contradiction inside of us, the coherence breaks, and you don't just feel uncertain, you feel fraudulent, you feel morally fraudulent. So this is the risk. If you revise your personal values without a stable interpretive framework for doing so, you don't just change your behavior. You destabilize the logic of your past choices, and it creates a lot of instability. Why did I do that? Maybe I should have done this and not that. Should I have broken up with that person? Should I have left that job? I don't know. And right, like you shift everything, and your retrospective lens no longer empowers your narrative self-understanding the way it used to. Everything feels like it needs to be rewritten. And the question is, do you need to do all that work every time you grow? So to take this a level deeper and to answer that question, I want to look at a myth. This is a myth about identity. And it's called the myth of the continuous self. So modern culture tells us a contradictory story. It tells us that you must be authentic to yourself and also constantly evolving. But what happens when the self that made your earlier choices no longer feels like the one that's here now? So, Galen Strawson, in his work Against Narrativity, he argues that continuity is a myth. That most people, Strawson writes, don't live with a coherence of past and future identity. They operate episodically in life, responding to immediate experience when filtering it through a long-term self-concept. And for these people, trying to justify every decision as part of a single arc in your story only produces confusion. You see this a lot of times, you see this a lot of different places. But just for one example, you see this in like religious conversion narratives, right? I used to be this, but then the Lord did this, and now I'm this, right? And then their life doesn't produce the results they want, right? And they maybe have some additional impurities or imperfections according to their system that they want to extract from their life. And so they look back at their initial conversion and they say, "Oh, I was half-hearted, and and then that's when my real conversion date happened on February 2nd, and I recommitted myself to the Lord, and He's been doing great." So everything they're constantly trying to write a coherent narrative, and they use the conversion trope as a way to constantly rewrite why things aren't working in their life, and why the now makes sense and why the past makes sense in light of the now. Right. But that, I mean, again, it's not unique to that kind of community or that kind of experience. We all do this kind of thing. So Strawson's insight about we don't truly live with an identity that is conceived as a single arc across our story. We live episodically, right? So Strawson's insight here has utility. So if identity is not necessarily continuous in that pure sense, then changing your values doesn't require a seamless story. It requires local integrity, not chronologically universal integrity or integrity that spans your whole lifespan. Right. So in other words, it's more important that your values work now than that they align with who you thought you were. And the fear of losing yourself might just be the refusal to admit that the person who made those earlier decisions in your life doesn't need to be preserved. So if that's the case, then why not just constantly change our values with no consequence? So we've kind of put these two things forward, right? Where change is prohibitively destructive or prohibitively disruptive rather in our lives, to the point where we resist and refuse change, to the other completely local and episodic conception of personal values, where we just get to revise those things over and over and over again with in recognition of the fact that our identities are not continuous. We've abandoned the myth of the continuous self, right? So on this side, you've got an extremist fundamentalist view of the continuous self, and over here you've got a hardcore episodic view of the continuous self. And so what we want to offer is something that can accommodate adaptability and continuity in a way that creates traction generating friction between continuity and the episodic. So we want our lives to make sense, which is why change of our personal value system still requires interpretation. We want to look back and see some legible structure in the arc. That's the continuous self myth, right? That's where philosopher Paul Ricoeur's corrective matters. So in Ricoeur's work, One Self as Another, I remember reading this book a long time ago, over a decade ago. He argues that identity is not something that is discovered, or identity is not something that you even invent. It's something that is narrated. It's fundamentally, The primitive format of the legible self is narration, it's story. And narration does not require sameness. Narration requires intelligibility. And a person becomes themselves by integrating rupture into the story, not by avoiding it. So this gives us kind of a third path between the myth of the continuous self and the highly episodic self. So you don't so when you feel your values shift and the conflict situations of life create stress tests that your values fail, therefore compel change within you. Right? You don't have to start the story over from chapter 1 every time that happens. What you need is a structure that allows contradiction without collapse so that the continuity we're looking for in the self becomes a narrative continuity that the self inhabits. So continuity or continuousness is not the quality of the self, it's the quality of the story about the self. And narrative coherence isn't about your story and keeping your story straight in life. It's about developing the ability to say, that version of me was not false, and it was functional at the time, and now it's not functional. So, in light of all that, how do you actually revise your value system? Well, a value system is not a list. It's a network of permissions and constraints that generate a sense of internal consistency. It's a system of trade-offs you're willing to make. So when you change a value, you're changing the pressure system. And to preserve coherence during that change, you have to do three things. Number one, you have to retain the original rationale. You don't have to keep the rule, but you should name the purpose it served. So if you abandon rigor, and clarify what it protected. If you soften independence, identify what it shielded you from. This keeps the prior version legible to you so you can understand the story. Don't alienate past versions of yourself because you'll lose sight of why you have the values that you have now. You don't alienate versions of you that you even may no longer agree with, because what you do is you understand the function they played at the time. And if you understand the function the previous values played in your life, the better you understand the function your old values played in your life that you disagree with now, the better you'll understand the function of your current values in your life now. So to preserve narrative coherence in the moral arc of your personal values story, number one, retain the original rationale. Number two, define the new cost structure. So every value change reintroduces risk. A softer stance might invite entanglement, and a looser boundary might invite confusion. Don't treat this as a flaw. Treat it as a trade-off, as all personal values are, that your new configuration is willing to accept. And then three, articulate continuity at the level of function, not form. So retain the original rationale, define the new cost structure, and articulate continuity at the level of function, not form. So you might no longer act the same way. You might no longer call your personal value the same thing, but what principle are you still serving? If you change how you speak, are you still protecting clarity? If you give up control or independence in your life, are you still preserving integrity? This is the thread that holds that system together, identifying continuity and function through the narrative. Right? So without these elements, value revision looks like moral drift and identity crisis. But with them, it looks like authorship and narrative intelligibility. So, to wrap all things up, I want to basically say that the value that holds its place in your life is the one that you can replace. A rigid value system feels stable because it's change resistant until it starts breaking everything around it or being crushed by the conflict situations of life. Flexible value system, a supple, nimble value system, feels unstable until you realize that coherence isn't about preservation of the myth of the continuous self. It's about structure that can hold change. The goal isn't to have values that never change. It's to have a system that doesn't collapse when they do change. Because the value that truly governs your life isn't the one you protect from revision. It's the one you know how to rebuild at a functional level when it no longer makes sense.